Hello, everybody, and welcome to the brand new show, Reasonable Minds Can Differ. I am really excited to have you all here, and I'm really excited for the folks that have popped in, having faith in me and what I could talk about with respect to this topic without knowing what this show was even going to be. So thank you so much for being here already. I have so much to talk about. I'm going to jump straight in. So first and foremost, what is this thing? Right? What is Reasonable Minds Can Differ? You know, I say it a lot. Is that just a vocal tick in my virtual legality episodes? Is that just something that pops into my head and I say it because I have to? No, this is a motto that I've lived my entire life by. Reasonable minds can differ. That somebody disagreeing with your opinion is not a de facto reason to think that they are subhuman, a monster, or otherwise. And even with that as my motto out there in social media, I have seen so many people come to me and say, okay, but what about unreasonable minds, right? And I understand that. I understand you look at something that is offered by someone out in the world and you say that must be unreasonable. That must be something that I can ignore because they are a monster. And we're going to talk about that as part of this topic today. But in respect of that motto, I wanted to make clear that that is not what I believe in. That I believe that people can come to different conclusions based on the same set of facts because we all have different values. And I wanted to make a show about that notion. I wanted to make a show that didn't require us to tap into a specific business or legal problem as we do in virtual legality, or even on the way a news item is being reported in the journalistic sphere as we do in Hangouts and Headlines. I wanted to make a video series that talked about important issues of the day, but in a way that we could all understand was not designed to attack others, to undermine the dignity of our fellow human beings, but that we could model for folks how these discussions should go in the real world. And I've been thinking about this for what my wife tells me is more than a year. There were versions of this throughout where I was thinking about how I wanted to put this out there. And unfortunately, recent events really accelerated my thought process here. And that recent event, of course, is the assassination of Charlie Kirk. That's why we're here today. We're going to talk about that. But what is this thing? This thing is a show designed to talk about those really serious issues in a way that we can show in our community and beyond, hopefully, on the internet at large, how reasonable minds can differ in a way that allows us to learn and grow from each other, from our other perspectives that are brought into our circle of understanding, and not just attack each other as subhuman, as monsters, or otherwise. As I say in this tweet about this show, I expect we'll have a lot to differ upon. And I'm really relying on the community here to show me the differences, to show me where I've missed something, where I've mischaracterized something, where I've got something wrong. I'm going to talk about Charlie Kirk in just a minute when we talk about the background of this topic. But one of the things that I saw when I was watching the clips of him and when I was evaluating what happened was a person that was going out there and having these conversations in a way where when he could have been attacking, he demurred and he looked instead at people's grace. Now, there are instances where that's not the case. I know that already. We can talk about those later on in this episode. But more importantly, for purposes of this show, I wanted to help model what I saw there as having those conversations, even when there are deep fundamental disagreements between us as human beings. Further, I wanted folks in the community to feel free to disagree with me. I want to know where I'm wrong. I want you to bring those to my attention. We're going to talk about the structure of this series in just a second, but I want you guys to be ready on those comments to say, Rick, you're mischaracterizing this. Rick, you got this part wrong. Please bring those to my attention when we get to the differences section of this episode, and you will have your time in the sun to tell me just how much of an idiot I am. Hopefully not in so many words, but that's what this show design is to do. Or as I say here with the note on format, I want to bring the motto to life, to show you how I come to my understandings of things, to work through really a kind of almost mental stream of consciousness as we go through these various propositions that we're about to discuss, have you disagree with me at the end, and to talk through those disagreements. And I promise as part of that process that there will be no name calling. I will not dismiss any reasoned criticism that is brought to my attention in any way. That doesn't mean I will agree with you at the end of things, but I promise to keep an open mind and to have those conversations, and in that way to demonstrate the value of the entire Reasonable Minds Can Differ philosophy and approach. That's really the intent of this entire show, to foster reasoned debate and consideration in the often rough and tumble world of the internet. As such, and this was something that was a part of the design of this show as long as a year ago, This is going to be free and clear to clip and to use for any other content creator that wants to react to these things. I want this conversation to not necessarily be limited to these bounds of this channel. If you see something that you want to react to and you're otherwise making videos, clip them, do those things. There will be no claims. There will be no strikes from me. Just tag me. Let me know that you're using it for that purpose. Link to the original if you can. All of that is in the description to this video that you can see, but that's the idea. We are going to have a conversation here. We are going to model for the internet and for the world that these conversations can be had, that they are important to be had, and hopefully we're going to make a difference out there in the world because, honestly, the world needs to have some differences made. In so doing, we're going to structure these episodes in essentially two halves. In the first half, we're going to do propositions. Now, I was kind of raised in the world of intellectual thought in parliamentary debate procedures, right? And we're not going to debate things here. This isn't a debate show necessarily, but I am going to raise propositions. Things like this house believes Elvis has left the building. This house believes that liberty is more important than security, whatever it might be. I'm going to raise those propositions in these episodes of Reasonable Minds Can Differ. And when I'm done with that, I'm going to take a brief break. I'm going to get myself a tea. I'm going to come back to comments and you're going to tell me what your difference of opinion is on whatever propositions I raise. Now, normally, when we get this show up and running, when we're doing things every way the way I want them to be, it's probably only going to be one proposition at a time. I would hope for that to be 7 to 10 minutes. This is not a deep dive lawsuit analysis like you might see in Virtual Legality. It is not reading 16 articles as you might see in Hangouts and Headlines. This is designed to be higher order than that. Really, me making assertions of some kind or another. And when I make those assertions, I do want to point out, as I have obviously in the title of this video series, that Reasonable Minds Can Differ. That is a sentence that I could say after basically everything I'm about to tell you in this video. Just assume after I say anything that I have just then said afterwards, but Reasonable Minds Can Differ. Rather than subject you to that for the entirety of this video and video series, I will just recommend that you look at the, let's see if I get this direction right, the top right of the screen, hashtag RMCD, Reasonable Minds Can Differ on all these things, and please bring to my attention when we get to the differences section exactly what differences you have on any given proposition. You will be afforded the chance to do so. I will stick with making the episode as long as I can, as long as I can physically sustain being here, if there are continued comments that need to be had to show me where I'm wrong in various things that I'm about to say. That is my promise to you. That is my desire for this show. So let's see. I don't actually remember exactly what I've put here in these various spots. So it's going to be a little bit of a journey with all of us as we see exactly what I've got set up in these tabs for us all to talk about. But one of the things I wanted to talk about as part of these events was that this show exists because of these events. This show exists even though I don't necessarily want to be talking about any of this with the policy or politics specificity that you might want of me. This is not going to be a politics show necessarily. It's not going to be about abortion or whether or not we should build a wall on our border or whatever else is happening in any other country of the world. It's going to be about higher order philosophy and things of that nature that I think are very, very important to talk about. And why is it in that structure? Well, for one reason, because when Charlie Kirk got shot while he was speaking to students at Utah Valley University, I think I got that name right, one of the things that occurred to me after I watched some of his clips and I was evaluating what I thought about these events was that I was out there with the notion of Reasonable Minds Can Differ. There are people right now wearing Reasonable Minds Can Differ sweatshirts, and I would feel so bad if somebody got shot for wearing the notion of Reasonable Minds Can Differ. And I was really considering stopping making any content on YouTube whatsoever. I really was. Not just because I don't want to be a part of the outrage mobs, I don't want to be a part of the culture wars, but also because I don't want to have folks out there representing what I think is a very good philosophy and a very good motto, and having others take that in a way that they think is deserving of getting shot. And so I really, really thought about this. And ultimately, as I thought about this and it metabolized and crystallized in my head, I thought, no, we're not going to cower. We're not going to go into hiding. We are going to espouse the values that I hold so dear and that I think was a kindred spirit in Charlie Kirk. We're going to talk about that in just a minute on this point. And we are going to really get out there with Reasonable Minds Can Differ as an even stronger message than it already was from me. So I hope you will bear with me on that. I don't mean to evangelize philosophical points like this, but it's very important to me. It's the reason why I am making this episode the way I am making it. And my intent is for this entire process to be a little bit more chilled out than some of the other content that I make, a little bit less firebrand-y than some of the other content I make, a little bit more of a conversation, a little bit more casual, if only to demonstrate that we can talk about very serious existential things in a way that doesn't undermine each other's humanity, that allows us to have these conversations from a reasonable minds can differ standpoint and get through our day without hating each other and acknowledging that there are reasonable differences that people can have in politics or otherwise. That's the show. I hope it makes sense to all of you all. I saw somebody just gifted Hoeg Law memberships. I really appreciate it. Lady Draconis in the chat right now. I will say I'm mostly not going to be paying attention to the chat, even super chats, for the first half, the propositions section of this show. I'm going to be talking you through my mental processes about how I thought about all these things, how I think about all these things. You will see how I work through my thoughts. Again, it will be a little bit stream of consciousness. I didn't write a script for this. I didn't write a speech or anything like that, but I have thought long and hard about what I want to say about these things. So we'll see how it goes from there. Now, if you haven't heard the news, we have to get into the background of all this. We have to understand what's happening. Why are we talking about this? And in all honesty, when this news came to my attention last, I think it was Wednesday, that Charlie Kirk, a conservative wunderkind, as described by the New York Times, who through his radio show, books, political organizing, and speaking tours, did much to shape the hard right movement that has coalesced around President Trump, becoming a close ally of his, died on Wednesday in Orem, Utah, after he had been shot while speaking at a college campus event. He was 31. And I looked at all this and I said, all right, I, as a person, am not a politico, right? I don't love cults of personality. I don't love fervor behind politicians, behind rock band members, behind anything. I just don't love that vibe. So I mostly stay out of the space of social media influencers. I know of them. I know Hassan Piker got an op-ed in, I think, the New York Times after this killing happened. I know that Ben Shapiro is out there making comments. I know Candace Owens is out there making comments. I know of these people out there making comments, but for the most part, as someone that really values his own reasoned mind, I don't love the extremes to which these people present these things. So for the most part, I didn't know who Charlie Kirk was. I'm just going to level with anybody in the chat or otherwise listening to this show later on. I didn't know who Charlie Kirk was. Every time I saw a clip of him come by my Twitter feed, and it was often, I thought he was this guy. And I'm highlighting now Rob McElhenney, and I'm sure I mispronounced him, from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. But I thought it was this guy every single time. And I remember thinking in my head, it's kind of odd that an actor is going out to these various campus communities and talking about these issues. I wonder why he's doing that. But I really didn't put two and two together. It's such a large media landscape. And I know you all know this already that are watching or listening to this show, but it's such a large media landscape that nobody can be familiar with every speaker, every precept, every outlet. And that's just the nature of the thing. It's why the loss of institutional trust is so severely felt, is we can't know everything. We have to put our trust in understanding some things. And ultimately, I didn't know who Charlie Kirk was. I then saw the assassination. Obviously, I think we all did on the internet, something I would have preferred not to see, in all honesty. I saw it, and I then said, I got to learn more about this guy. What riled people up so much? How did we get into this position? And I saw him described as a racist. I saw him described as a bigot and all these various things. And I had to be honest. I said, that wouldn't surprise me from a right-wing influencer. Just looking at what I knew from these outlets. That's where I was at. And then I watched some clips. I watched some clips of him primarily in his prove me wrong kind of stance, where he puts up a tent at these college campuses and he says, I'm going to open up a microphone to you. And he gets a line of people and they go and ask him questions for, 10 or 15 minutes. And he responds to them. And I think predominantly this was a marketing move. He was able to get viral clips out of his conversations with these people to market his political motivating entity, Turning Point USA. That's why Turning Point is on the thumbnail and title to this video. But I watched these videos and I kept expecting him to really attack in a very kind of aggressive way when some of these folks brought extremely leftist or liberal positions into his face. And every single time what I saw, on those clips, and obviously they're self-selected for my viewing pleasure by the algorithm or the people that are trying to say something about Charlie Kirk or otherwise, was a person who, when given the opportunity to just attack, showed grace, showed the dignity of the human experience. And as I saw this, as I evaluated this, that's when I made that tweet about, I'm just not sure that Reasonable Minds Can Differ should go out there into the world, because it got this guy shot in the face. And then I did some further research. I looked at more things about Charlie Kirk, and I am fully willing to admit that some of the times when you're watching these clips and you see these arguments that he makes, he goes to the extreme. He takes an extreme position. And I do think that some folks say, well, look, that's part and parcel to how we get into this kind of tribalistic political mentality right now. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that you're wrong. I'm going to say that perhaps it's not the appropriate time to bring up immediately following the man's assassination. That's a different kind of argument. That's a different kind of thing to discuss. But suffice it to say, it is clear to me that I'm not Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk is not me, despite what you might be seeing on social media. We think of debate in a very different way, but we also have very different ends. Right? Charlie Kirk had decided that what he wanted to do with his life was he wanted to drum up support for conservative causes, that the other side of the political spectrum in the United States was too dangerous or too damaging. So he was going to do this primarily by getting youth vote efforts out the door. And he saw that best way to do that was by getting viral video clips made of him, quote unquote, owning the libs or what have you. Now, I will promise you this. If we get to the differences section of this video and we wind up with a clip that somebody makes where Hoeg owns someone or someone owns Hoeg, we will have done it wrong. That is not what I'm about. That is not what Reasonable Minds Can Differ is about as a series. But again, my goal here is to espouse the value of reasoned debate and differences and the fact that it is how we grow. So proposition number one for this episode of Reasonable Minds Can Differ is that reasonable minds can in fact differ, that difference doesn't make you de facto unreasonable, and that difference is how we grow. Someone asked me while I was tweeting about this last week, what happens when there's somebody that's just absolutely intractable, that they cannot be reasoned with. And I have to acknowledge that there are unreasonable minds, right? There are prejudices, there are bigotry, there are things that people arrive at as their position on the world that don't come from a space of reason. But even with that as our understanding, there is still value in at least showing that you recognize that lack of reason and establishing that that lack of reason exists, because you are not alone when you are talking with someone on social media. You're not alone, certainly, when you're talking about something on a YouTube video like this one. There are always outside observers. Reasonable minds can differ. Yes, absolutely. We've talked about that already. But not only can they differ, it's important to show those differences. It's important to evaluate the other ways in which somebody can see the world, to not immediately assume that they are monstrous. And by talking with those folks on a reasoned basis, you learn more where the strengths and weaknesses of your own logic are, where your thought process maybe isn't as complete as it needs to be. And if you're talking with an unreasonable person, which some of the videos with Charlie Kirk seem to indicate that he was, then you still have value, because you can show how you can treat that argument with grace and dignity. You can expose the lack of reason in that argument, and the audience can grow. So there is always value in Reasonable Minds Can Differ. This is proposition one. Obviously, as we launch this show, this was an important one to be the very first proposition that we make on this show. But it was really Charlie Kirk out there with the prove me wrong tent, talking about these things with various people. And yes, in a somewhat more aggrandized way than I do, what I described on Twitter as a little bit more trolling than I would like. And I think we'll see that in a bit. I think I have that set up to be a tab, but we will see. But he was out there at least acknowledging that it's important to look people in the face, to acknowledge their human experience and existence, and then disagree with them on your fundamental value structure and beliefs at the same time. So I want to be out there saying this as loudly and as one voice as I can, that reasonable minds can differ, that America has a future, that we can have that future as long as we can continue to talk things out. And we need to continue to do that and not do the opposite in the aftermath of this unfortunate tragic series of events. Which leads me to what I thought was the best article on this particular topic that I saw from the New York Times. It's an opinion editorial from Ezra Klein, who was not a fellow traveler in the world of politics. If you are listening or watching this from outside the United States, he was basically on the opposite side of all this. But I wanted to read just a few excerpts from this opinion editorial if you haven't seen it already. The foundation of a free society is the ability to participate in politics without fear of violence. To lose that is to risk losing everything. Charlie Kirk and his family just lost everything. As a country, we came a step closer to losing everything too. I truly believe this. I was massively affected by this series of events, and we'll talk about why about that in just a minute. On Wednesday, Kirk, the founder of Turning Point USA, was gunned down during a speech at Utah Valley University. You can dislike much of what Kirk believed in, and the following statement is still true. Kirk was practicing politics in exactly the right way. He was showing up to campuses and talking with anyone who would talk to him. He was one of the era's most effective practitioners of persuasion. And I disagree with Ezra Klein only in one small respect here, and that's exactly the right way. Again, my preference would be to be more reasoned, to not go out to these extremes, to make these statements that make for the owned video clips. But I can't tell you, I can't promise you that I would be exactly right in terms of the political sphere. I've said to a lot of people that say I should run for something that I think I would be a terrible politician, right? I do not have either the gut instinct or the inclination to go and find the most extreme defensible position that I can so that I can make it into a soundbite or I can make it into a clip. I'm very nuanced. I like to think about these things and talk about them to a great extent. And unfortunately, that does mean in 2025 that maybe that's not the most effective political way. So even as I criticize Ezra Klein here for saying it was exactly the right way, he might be right and I might be wrong. That's how I think through these things. And I am not a perfect arbiter of what is right or wrong, but I do think this is a very effective opinion editorial. A taste for disagreement is a virtue in a democracy. Hear, Ezra Klein. Say it again for those in the back. In the inaugural episode of his podcast, Governor Gavin Newsom of California, a noted liberal on the opposite side of the political spectrum from Kirk, admitted that his son was a huge fan. What a testament to Kirk's project. I've seen two forms of reaction that are misguided, says Mr. Klein. One is a move on the left to wrap Kirk's death around his views. After all, he defended the Second Amendment, even admitting it meant accepting innocent deaths. Another is on the right to turn his murder into a justification for an all-out war. And believe me, we're going to talk about that as well. There is no world in which political violence escalates but is contained to just your foes. And we will get to that as part of our conversation. When political violence becomes imaginable, either as a tool of politics or a ladder for fame, it begins to infect hosts heedlessly. That violence is not the answer to any of these things. That violence is the antithesis. It is the opposite, is the antimatter to reasonable minds can differ. Reasonable minds can differ is discourse is what's important. Discussion is what's important. That's how we learn. That politics is the art of compromise in a large society that has many, many, many different views. And that to end that with a bullet or any other device that you might end it with is an absolute attack on everything that politics as the virtues of the polity, the people of society holds dear, right? And I agree with Ezra Klein completely on this. Both sides are meant to be on the same side of a larger project. We are all, or most of us anyway, trying to maintain the viability of the American experiment. We can live with losing an election because we believe in the promise of the next election. We can live with losing an argument because we believe that there will be another argument. Political violence imperils that, and it does. And so I wanted to highlight that for you because this was one of the op-eds that I saw that really said, Rick, you got to get out there. You got to talk about these issues with folks. Even as I also said, I think that Charlie Kirk as a person was too beholden to MAGA, Make America Great Again, the movement that Donald Trump started, and President Trump, and a bit too in love with a trolling style of argumentation I don't find particularly useful. But you know what? He would have tried to convince me I was wrong. And that's the right way, right? One can easily imagine a Charlie Kirk coming in here and saying, yeah, Rick, I maybe go to extremes. I maybe say things that are more extreme than you would in these contexts. And maybe I know that I lose a little bit of nuance. I lose a little bit of resolution on the far ends. But that's what's needed to get more people to understand the stakes of these particular issues, to get more people on those turning point buses to vote. And it's more important for Donald Trump to be president than Kamala Harris to be president. And look, reasonable minds can absolutely differ on even that value proposition. But I can certainly imagine him making that case and me having that conversation with him would have been illuminating for me and for him and for the people that watched it, I think. And unfortunately, a bullet prevents us from ever having that conversation. And that's why I'm making this video today. That said, Charlie Kirk, not a saint, and a number of people disagree with what Ezra Klein had to say. Or as Mother Jones put it, no, Charlie Kirk was not practicing politics the right way. As you can imagine, this is a direct response to the op-ed we just read. I don't know what I've highlighted here. We'll view it all together. Kirk built his movement with falsehoods. Kirk, a right-wing provocateur who founded and led Turning Point USA, an organization of young conservatives, was a promoter of Trump's destructive and baseless conspiracy theory that the 2020 election was stolen from him. 2 days before the January 6th riot, Kirk boasted in a tweet that students for Trump and Turning Point Action were sending 80-plus buses full of patriots to D.C. to fight for this president. After the attack, Kirk deleted the tweet, and he claimed that the people his group transported to D.C. participated only in the rally that occurred before the assault on Congress, where Trump whipped up the crowd and encouraged it to march on the Capitol. The New York Times subsequently reported that Turning Point Action sent only 7 buses to the event, so that he was lying on the amount of buses that were sent in the first instance. Turning Point also paid the $60,000 speaking fee to Kimberly Guilfoyle, a MAGA personality, for the brief remarks she made at the rally. And so you see this article is attempting to cast Charlie Kirk in a very specific light, that he was this negative force primarily because he helped get Donald Trump elected. And I can't tell anybody that looks at the Trump administration or looks at the way the United States is currently being led and say that that is necessarily a wrong-headed position to take. But I can say that it maybe looks a little bit in the time frame in which these articles were all written like you're trying to justify a political assassination. I don't love that. Right? Ezra Klein is exactly right that we have to keep that bright line in place. What bright line is that? That politics and political violence can never meet. We'll get to that proposition in just a minute. I also wanted to point out that there are ways in which Charlie Kirk is misrepresented by the various places that are looking at this particular topic. As I said at the top of this video, I looked at these videos and I looked at the way that he spoke about these issues, and I saw someone that went further than I would and that went to extremes when he was trying to make his points, but that ultimately was someone that was not all of the various ists that you want to put on him. He just was someone that didn't necessarily share your views of the world and how it should be conducted. So this is an article that I saw that said these are all of his really bad quotes, and you'll see these in various places on social media and the like. If I see a black pilot, I'm going to be like, boy, I hope he's qualified. Black people... Prowling blacks go around for fun to go target white people. That's a fact. It's happening more and more. And if you go look at these sources, what you will see is a man that actually appears to have a nuanced take on the Civil Rights Act and the effects of affirmative action and diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in the United States. And you can look at those things and you can say, he's exactly wrong on those. But that doesn't lead me to look at that and say he's a bigot, he's a racist, he hates black people. He appears to be making these arguments from my interpretation of what he puts out there or put out there into the world on the premise that things like the Civil Rights Act, which we'll see he was against in some of these speeches and which you'll see talked about with respect to him after his assassination, were ultimately deleterious to the African-American population in the United States, that they harmed them in some way. And if you think that, if you honestly think that, then it is on you to say that they are wrong, right? And that comes from a place essentially of love and not bigotry, that I don't think that black Americans should have to go through this notion of, I hope he's qualified if he's a black pilot, because I know affirmative action put certain people in different spots in American society on different metrics because we wanted to make sure that more black Americans got more jobs. I look at that and say, okay, that's a nuanced position. You have framed it in your podcast so that you can get quotes and retweeted and things like this for a section of the populace that might well be bigoted and racist. And someone can come to me and say, you know what? Charlie Kirk was making tribalism worse. He got Donald Trump elected. He was saying all these things. He was fomenting this kind of unease, this friction in the American polity that I didn't like. But I think you're going too far if you take what he's said in these various places and forms and say that he was necessarily a racist. Now, I know just saying that here on YouTube is going to have some of you make some comments about me. That's okay. We're going to talk about all of this, especially when we get to the second half of this video. But I wanted to say that's what I evaluated when I looked at everything about this man after the fact. I was not a fan of Charlie Kirk. After I looked at these clips, after I looked at the various things that were said about him, especially after his assassination, I looked at all of this and said, I wish that I was able to have the reach that he did to talk about freedom of speech issues, freedom of expression issues, and get out there and really talk to the people about what I see as these hugely controversial topics that are really getting lost in the weeds of talking heads and points of emphasis from each that is just designed to be as outrageous as possible so that you can drum up fundraising for your political party or the next. And so that's what I see when I see these kind of quotes. If you look at these various other sources where the quotes come from, you will see some of that the reason he's talking about the airline pilots is because he wanted to talk about essentially what the old conservatives back when I was a kid used to call the soft bigotry of low expectations. And he wanted to talk about all of those things, but in a soundbite form that I don't love. I don't love his politics. I don't love that kind of trolling style. I see it a lot in the social media presence of Vice President J.D. Vance in America. That is not the way I prefer things. It's not the way I like politics to go in the United States. But I am also at least sympathetic, if not empathetic, to the notion that if I were a politico and I was trying to move people into a political movement, I might be more sympathetic to that position on the whole, right? I have a very different goal here with my YouTube channel, with my law practice, with the comments that I make to you all in the chat and otherwise, than Charlie Kirk does when he's trying to put kids in turning point buses and take them to rallies and get them to vote for the guy that he thinks is the best person to lead the United States. So that's what I see. You can see all of these articles online. This is not, again, a video series that is designed to have me read through articles and give all this evidence to you. These are primarily propositions that are supported by my thought process, but are just propositions that can be debated in the second half of this video if you would like to do so. But I wanted to highlight them for you all. I also wanted to highlight that Ezra Klein, the author of the op-ed we read at the start of this section of the video, has gotten a lot of pushback for what he wrote. And we'll see if Twitter actually deigns to pull it up for us here live. But Ezra Klein says, in reaction to his pushback, honestly, it's too little to say we just oppose political violence. In ways that surprised me, given what I thought of Kirk's project, I was and am grieving for Kirk himself. Not because I knew him. I didn't, and I certainly don't. Not because he was a saint. He wasn't. Not because I agreed with him. No, most of what he poured himself into trying to achieve, I pour myself into trying to prevent. But I find myself grieving for him because I recognize some commonality with him. He was murdered for participating in our politics. Somewhere beyond how much divides us, there was something that bonded us too. Some effort to change this country in ways that we think are good. I believe this so strongly. We have to be able to see that the bullet that tore into him was an act of violence against us all. And this is what I reflected on after the assassination. I'm just a guy with a microphone, right? I've made Virtual Legality and Hangouts and Headlines now for coming up on, I think, 7 years at this point. And this is a brand new show that I'm launching today so that we can have more conversations like this one. But I'm a guy with a microphone that wants to go and espouse that we can have conversations about really important things without cutting each other down in the comments or otherwise, without calling each other names, and that's how we grow. That's how we get better. That's how we understand ourselves and others. That's how everybody that watches us involved in that process also grows, and that assassinating someone on a college campus that has opened up a microphone to essentially tell him why he's wrong, getting assassinated in that way was essentially a bullet to freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and the entirety of American politics. I don't have to agree with Charlie Kirk and what he was putting out there into the world. I don't have to agree with anybody else that might have been in that tent and speaking if they got assassinated in the same kind of way. What I am talking about here, what offends me so deeply about this political violence, is that it cut down a person in the act of what I think is the most important part of the political process, and that is communicating with each other. You don't have to like what he said. You don't have to like how he said it. But I would ask that everybody understand that reasonable minds can differ. It's how we grow, and that this political violence is completely antithetical to that notion. Proposition number 2, especially if you already agree with proposition number 1, political violence is wrong, right? There are people out there online saying essentially a utilitarian argument that says, all right, I want the world to be this way. I want the United States to be governed in this fashion. I really hate Donald Trump, whatever it might be. And so I look at this and say, you know what? Charlie Kirk was good and effective at fighting me. He was the antithesis to what you saw, Ezra Klein just said. And he was good at his job. So if he is removed from the board, then I am advantaged, right? And you heard in that op-ed why you're not advantaged, why violence escalates without any control that anybody can have over it. And so while I understand the utilitarian argument where you can say my opponent is gone, and so now I can score my political points more easily, and that's a good thing overall, I argue here it is bad overall, right? That's without even getting into the murder component, right? Murder's bad. I didn't even add that as a proposition. I would hope we can all agree murder in general, bad. We don't want people killing people. That's the one crime maybe we can all agree on in all its forms. But in particular, taking down someone who is speaking, who is trying to affect political change in the United States, even if they are on the exact opposite side of you, is a wrong in and of itself. I would say this if it were Hassan Piker that got shot. I would say it if it were Donald Trump. I would say it if it were Joe Biden. It is wrong entirely, full stop, no other arguments to be had there. And even further than that, and I'm going to quote myself here because I've been tweeting a lot over the last week, it's not even limited as a concept to those that agree with Kirk, Trump, or anyone else, Joe Biden, Barack Obama, whatever person you want to put in that tent that gets shot. In fact, once you can and should shoot anyone whose views you find repugnant becomes seen as a valid motivating philosophy, there's no limiting principle at all. Literally everyone, meme, chuckles, I'm in danger from The Simpsons, right? That's the truth of the matter of this entire conversation. And I'll be honest, when I was talking to my wife, Mrs. Hoeg, who I think is still in the chat, about doing a show about this, one of the things she essentially said to me was, I don't know that I want you going out there because in the last week, someone that went out with a very similar message got shot. Now, I don't think I've got any risks outside my windows here as I record this video for you, but there is no question that even having these conversations at all right now feels fraught. And one of the things that I wound up thinking to myself when I put this show together was, I don't want it to feel fraught. It should not feel fraught. It should not feel dangerous to go out there and give your political or other philosophical arguments to the world. That's what democracy, republics, all kind of Western people-focused nations should have as the basis for their politics and policy. And so political violence is wrong. The fact that it has this chilling effect even on a little transaction lawyer in Michigan is absolutely antithetical to the entire American experience. And essentially, I made this show as a response to all of this, as a kind of you will not break me to the notion that political violence can stop these messages from going out. So I do thank Charlie Kirk as part of this video for that, because I think it motivated me to get off my butt and have these conversations that I think are so important and so necessary and have thought for a while, because even if you don't agree with him, you got to go out there, you got to make a difference. And I believe that to the core of my being. That's proposition 2. I think I've got 6 of these, folks. Proposition 3 is only violence is violence. And this is an important part of some of the slide that's happened in the last little while. One of the things that you will see in the articles about Charlie Kirk's assassination is that he got assassinated. Assassination is wrong. Proposition 2, political violence is wrong. But also, he was a bad dude, right? He said all these various things. He hated the Civil Rights Act. He did all these things to foment hate, or he was a bigot and a racist. And so he said these things, and reading between the lines of these articles is he deserved it, right? That things you can say, that words are violence. And the worst version of this, silence is violence, right? Because it justifies everything. Carte blanche to do anything you want to someone who isn't even involved and may not know there's anything to be involved with. So proposition 3 is only violence is violence. Words aren't violence. If you say words are violence, then it justifies the shooting of people that are just saying words. If you say silence is violence, it gets even worse from there. Only violence is violence. And I saw online someone say to me, well, then aren't you saying that things like emotional abuse don't exist? And no, that's not the intent here, right? You can absolutely abuse someone emotionally. In grade school, we might have heard sticks and stones may break your bones, but words can never hurt you. We know words can hurt, obviously. Even the words I'm saying right now in this video might hurt someone in the chat. I would hope not, but they can. And so we know words can hurt, but I think we need to make definitionally clear that there is a categorical difference between isolating someone, being mean to them, belittling them, and hitting them in the face. Right? There is a difference between physical violence and emotional abuse. And it's important to understand that words can suck. You can hate somebody for those words if you deem it appropriate, but that's different from shooting them in the face. Why? Because the person who is still in existence can respond. They can change their ways. They can be saved if you're of a more religious persuasion, however you want to frame it. And that all ends. The game is over when they get shot in the neck. And so only violence is violence. We have to avoid the slippery slope of characterizing things that aren't violence as violence. Why? Because it winds up justifying violence, right? And I am not suggesting that only the people that were against Charlie Kirk come to that conclusion and make trouble for everybody out there online. I saw a tweet here from Ian Miles Chong on September 14th that was bringing up a video of somebody getting beaten in a theater, and he said that this is the way you save the culture. And I said, no, violence is always bad. You don't save the culture this way, whatever that means to Mr. Chong here. But that's an important part of the precepts of this conversation. Violence is violence. Words aren't violence, not in the way that we mean when we talk about these things at this level. Next on our list, and very similar to only violence is violence, is that labels are dehumanizing and that dehumanization enables violence, right? And you see this a lot, right? This was my introduction to Twitter and social media in general, which was that when I joined Twitter, I think in 2018, you can check me on that if you're so inclined, one of the things I saw was a lot of comments going around that we needed to start punching Nazis in the face, right? And hello, YouTube. Yes, I said the word Nazis. Not a Nazi, but I appreciate that you will be reviewing this video now. Thank you so much. But you should punch Nazis in the face. And I said, no, you shouldn't be punching Nazis in the face because we as a society have due process. We have a whole system of things that we put in place to make sure that we are punishing people that society deems appropriate to punish. And if people are just out there being Batman, selecting for themselves who's a Nazi, who's a fascist, who's a communist, who's vermin, whatever it might be, then ultimately we are just living in a mob society and there isn't any justice to be found. Mob justice, not real justice. Another one of the propositions that didn't make the cut. But that's the truth, that labeling someone dehumanizes them. That you call them a Nazi, you call them a fascist, you call them a bigot, a racist, whatever it might be. The notion is that we don't need to engage with his commentary at all because he is worthy of scorn. And if we make those words harsh enough, if we use Nazi, if we call him modern day Hitler, then yeah, it's justified for someone to shoot someone else in the neck. Right? That's the notion of using these names. They enable violence. And especially they enable violence for those of us in society that maybe aren't as reasoned as others, right? If they just hear and legitimately believe that Charlie Kirk is modern day Hitler reborn, then that philosophical question of what would you do if you had a time machine and could go back to the time of baby Hitler doesn't become a philosophical question anymore, right? It becomes a notion of grabbing your father's hunting rifle and perching yourself on a roof somewhere. And that is no way to live. And I really firmly believe that. But as part of that conversation, it's important to note that when I said that, when I first joined Twitter, you can imagine in chat exactly how well this went. Don't pick out and punch Nazis for yourself. Got me called what? I think you already know this. A Nazi. Right? And I'm not a Nazi. It's unhealthy to label these things this way, but we still see this going on social media all over, right? Here are the 6 conservative Supreme Court justices. They say all in favor of fascism in this tweet. They say those opposed to this group of people out in the streets from somewhere. Don't know where this photo came from. And this is before the assassination happened. I said this is unhealthy. And I got all sorts of commentary to even saying that. And I'm no fan, if you've been following Virtual Legality for any amount of time at all, of Chief Justice Roberts or his court. And yet, if you say these 6 are fascists, then what you are saying realistically is that it wouldn't be such a bad thing if someone propped up on a roof and shot one or all of them in the neck. And so we need to be clear that labels are dehumanizing. And I would even take this further if we wanted to and say, look, all labels. It's not just Nazis and fascists and communists and vermin and whatever else you might say. It's left and right on the whole. Right? One of the propositions that also didn't make the cut, but almost did, was essentially it's not left versus right. It's death versus discourse, right? It's a red herring to get into this argument about whether or not the shooter in this case was a leftist or a rightist. I will tell you, frankly, that the evidence seems to be pointing pretty definitively that he was on the left side of the political equation. I will also say in that same breath that doesn't matter so much. It's a red herring, right? It is about whether we're willing to talk with each other or we shoot those that we oppose. And if you're on the side of reasonable minds can differ, then you are on the side of talking things out with one another, even if you think what they are saying is problematic or hateful or whatever other words you want to put on it. In this particular case, left versus right doesn't matter as much as whether or not you're in the shooting people business or you're in the talking to people business. And so labels, even left and right, I know it's important to use shorthand in order to have conversations at all, but even those labels put people into groups so that you can dismiss them out of hand, so that you can justify various actions that you might take with respect to them. Hopefully not even going so far as to shoot them, but just to say, I'm not going to listen to that person. That person associates with folks I don't like. And so I'm going to ignore them and everything that they've ever said. And I've been online long enough. I've been out here making videos long enough to sit here and say, look, even making videos at Last Stand Media with Colin Moriarty got me blacklisted in certain places as essentially fascist adjacent. And I have long said that I go and make videos with people because I think even if I disagree with their politics, that it's important to get out there and communicate with them. That, hey, maybe we can have a good conversation. Maybe we can convince each other of various things. But more importantly, we can treat each other like human beings. That face-to-face contact was useful. And I actually think that's what was happening with Charlie Kirk and visiting these college campuses. Because one thing I will note is that when he was on his podcast, when he was doing things in a room somewhere and talking directly to camera, he was more incendiary. He was more trolling than he was in these videos where he was in the prove me wrong tent. I do think there is a value to actually talking things out with people eye to eye. And so one of the reasons I do as many collaborations as I do is that I don't think you should judge people just by their politics. And that's what left versus right as a label winds up doing. So that's Proposition 4. We're rolling through them pretty fast. I promise there will be a summary slide before we get into differences, but take notes, get ready with your own comments. We're getting close to the end here. I've got 6 propositions. Proposition 5, cancel culture is complicated. I don't really think this is arguable necessarily, but the things I'm about to say probably are. And if you aren't following this online, then one of the things you probably don't know about is that the right side of the political equation after Charlie Kirk's assassination essentially started keeping a list of the people that were interacting on social media in a way that they felt celebrated political assassination or celebrated in specific Charlie Kirk's murder. And cancel culture is one of those things where I personally find it a very complicated notion because I will sit here and tell you in virtual legality and otherwise that the First Amendment, the notion of freedom of speech, only restricts the ability of our governments in the United States from doing bad things to people that speak, right? Only the U.S. government and the various state governments are prohibited from taking negative action against someone when they speak out on some issue or another. The employers of the country, any other private entity, country club you might work with, they are completely entitled to separate their association from you if their association with you is deemed problematic to them in some form or fashion. So cancel culture is the extreme version of what I would have advocated for maybe only a decade or two ago, which is to say, if you don't like what somebody is out there doing or saying, then you go and you boycott your Walmart, you boycott your Target, or you tell people that they're saying these things and you get folks to change their position that way. But with social media, with the internet, and more importantly, in my opinion, with companies not being able to properly evaluate exactly what a firestorm online actually means to their business propositions, cancel culture as a whole has gotten far too strong. More importantly, with respect to the right-left kind of velocity in the United States political spectrum, it was seen as a predominantly left tactic and is now a right tactic on this particular score. But I think it's complicated for a number of reasons, right? If you're out there saying murder is okay, political assassination is okay, then I think it's probably justified to come after you maybe a little bit. And I think it's more important that people come after folks that are put in a position of trust than places that are not a position of trust. This is a nuanced argument, so I'd ask you to bear with me on this. But suffice to say, when I was in the hospital in the winter of 2023, I was completely at the mercy of my nurses and my doctors, and I had to have complete trust and faith in them that they wanted me to get better and that they were going to do their best using all medical procedures and abilities that they had to help me get better. And if a nurse, as a for instance, were out there saying that I think it's okay for Charlie Kirk to get murdered because I really hated his politics, I would be worried that the position of trust that that nurse was put in was potentially compromised by their political position. Further, I would also be worried that they didn't have the appropriate judgment to prevent themselves from going out with such an incendiary message online where anybody could see it. And so I think those areas, areas of primary school teachers where essentially you're putting kids in a black box, I think those areas are also areas where it's probably justified to say, look, they might be saying this off school hours or off nursing hours, but this tells us something about their judgment. This tells us something about what they actually feel. And we have questions about whether they can serve their constituency, the patients in their hospital, the kids in their school, in a way that we can feel safe about. Those are positions of public trust. So I think that is probably justified to actually go and say, all right, I'm concerned about those things. On the other side of the spectrum, though, I think one of the things that the right has tended to do with this is that they have elided the difference between I'm celebrating political assassination, I'm celebrating murder, and didn't really like Charlie Kirk, didn't really like what he had to say, right? So they've got this list up, and actually the website where they put this list doesn't appear to be accessible right now, so it might have gotten taken down. But they had this list up that said what these people said in response to the assassination of Charlie Kirk, and a lot of the things that they framed out were essentially Charlie Kirk was a bad guy, Charlie Kirk was a racist or whatever that we talked about earlier in this video. And I think, honestly, while I think that's completely antithetical to what I believe you should be saying about dead people of any stripe, once they are no longer able to defend themselves, I think you got to take that and say, all right, we'll put that particular issue that we have with that person in our back pocket, or we can save it for later when it's not immediately after their death. I don't love that. I think that's bad. I don't think necessarily that it should be an internet mob that is going and seeking that all these people lose their jobs. Now, to make it even more complicated, I will also say if you're at all even close to this particular issue and you are upset about losing your job and you're taking that upsettedness out online, it's very difficult if your message was political assassination is okay, that being murdered for speaking is an acceptable something in your particular worldview. It's very difficult for me to shed any tears over the much lesser penalty of losing your job over that same speech. So it's a very complicated issue. I think it's one that we needed to discuss here, but that's what I wanted to bring to the table on cancel culture in general. And I expect that some of you are going to have some thoughts about that overall. As for the last proposition today, proposition number 6, our leadership is failing us. I know some of you in virtual legality or that hear me talk about these things at length probably already know some of the things I'm going to say here. But one of the things I would say is that my hope, as you might have seen in one of the earlier tweets that I highlighted, was after all this happened, leadership would look at the situation and say, we need to take things down a notch. We need to look at the situation and say, we can't be shooting each other out there in the streets. We can't be getting to such a high level of vibration that it seems a good idea to no longer talk with one another, but instead to fight one another with weaponry. And instead, what happened was a series of things that I can actually barely contemplate. So here's a tweet from Representative Clay Higgins shortly after the assassination that said the following: I'm going to use congressional authority and every influence with big tech platforms to mandate immediate ban for life of every post or commenter that belittled the assassination of Charlie Kirk. Now remember, in the United States, we have the First Amendment. It says Congress shall make no law infringing the freedom of speech, which includes the freedom of expression. There is no law that is or could be enacted in the United States that would outlaw the belittling of someone or their assassination if they ran their mouth with their smart-ass hatred, celebrating the heinous murder of that beautiful young man who dedicated his whole life to delivering respectful conservative truth into the hearts of liberal enclave universities, armed only with a Bible and a microphone and a constitution. Those profiles must come down. So I'm going to lean forward in this fight, demanding that big tech have zero tolerance for violent political hate content, the user to be banned from all platforms forever. I mean, good Lord, right? I'm also going after their business licenses and permitting. Their businesses will be blacklisted aggressively. They should be kicked from every school, and their driver's licenses should be revoked. I'm basically going to cancel with extreme prejudice these evil, sick animals who celebrated Charlie Kirk's assassination. I'm starting that today. That is all. And this was the first thing that I saw immediately following the assassination. And like I said at the top of this video, the one thing that I really noted about Charlie Kirk's presence at these Prove Me Wrong tents was the notion that he felt it was important to have this freedom of speech, to have this freedom of expression, this conversation with people in real time. So one thing I was not expecting, and you can criticize me all you want when we get to the differences section on my naivete or political lack of acumen, if you are so inclined, was these particular conservative politicians coming out and saying, we are going to use the full power of the government to prevent anybody from saying anything bad about Charlie Kirk. It seems entirely the opposite of what Charlie Kirk would have wanted to come out of all this. JD Vance went on the Charlie Kirk show earlier this week and essentially said there's no unity with any of these people. They lie about Charlie Kirk and excuse the murder. They justify these various things. And he went out there with fire and brimstone and he said, we will not be united. We will be divided. This is what I expect from JD Vance. I do not like it. Our leadership is failing us. Proposition 6. And then yesterday, after I had fully prepped this video, but before I'm making it for you all today, Attorney General Pam Bondi said there's free speech and then there's hate speech. And there is no place, especially now, especially after what happened to Charlie in our society. We will absolutely target you, go after you if you are targeting anyone with hate speech, which is like, what are you even talking about? The entire notion of freedom of speech in the United States is that the government cannot act against speech that it hates, right? And I know Europe is different on this score. I know if you're calling in or you're otherwise following us on chat from Europe, I know your jurisdictions are different on this stuff. But freedom of speech in America very clearly does not separate free speech from hate speech, that hate speech is not a recognized legal category, and that we only really prevent you from defaming someone, lying about them to their damage, from inciting imminent threats of violence, and barely anything else. That the freedom of speech is a large bubble and the exceptions are very small in the United States. And this, our Attorney General saying this, is an affront to, in my opinion, everything Charlie Kirk stood for. Now, she continued, because she knew that she had spoken very broadly, and says hate speech that crosses the line into threats of violence is not protected by the First Amendment. No objection there, but that's not what you said. It's a crime. For far too long, we've watched the radical left normalize threats, call for assassinations, and cheer on political violence. That era is over. She cites some laws about imminent threat. Those are things that the courts have found are exceptions to the freedom of speech. They are not what she would characterize as hate speech. And what I tweeted about this was that you cannot play games with this stuff. You cannot play these word games. This is, in my opinion, a fireable offense, a resign-worthy offense for the chief law enforcement officer of the United States, except that I strongly suspect that it comes from the top, right? If we actually look a little further, one of the things that we see is that Donald Trump goes out there and says media outlets are engaging in hate speech by being unfair and maybe should be prosecuted. So it's no surprise, really, that the Attorney General is taking orders from the president. That's really how the executive branch is supposed to function. But I am honestly, as a fan of freedom of expression, as a fan of reasonable minds can differ, as scared of the Republican response to this in the United States as I am of the liberal response. That is God's honest truth. That is where I come at this issue at from you to end this video. And just to further my point, read what Charlie Kirk would think. Some people responded to the tweets I made on this subject with a Charlie Kirk quote from May of 2024, where he says, hate speech does not exist legally in America. There's ugly speech, there's gross speech, there's evil speech, and all of it is protected by the First Amendment. The First Amendment, freedom of speech as a concept in the United States founding, is the notion that you beat bad speech with better speech. You don't outlaw it. You don't have the government deciding what's hate speech, what's good and what's evil. You don't have somebody shoot at you from the roof for saying things that they don't like. That is antithetical to the American experience. And it hurts me at my core that the politicians of the United States are taking an opportunity like Charlie Kirk's assassination to go out there and do the exact opposite of what it would seem that Charlie Kirk would have wanted. I can't speak for him. He's gone now. I can't read the hearts or minds of any other human being that's not gone yet. But it sure seems, in everything that I've seen of the way he operated, that this concept of the conservative Republicans of the United States, that he would have called his friends, I believe, going out there and using his assassination to clamp down on speech in America is abhorrent to me. And so Proposition 6 is our leadership is failing us. those are the 6 propositions that I have brought today. Folks, it is now time to make your point. I've got Prove Me Wrong, which was Charlie Kirk's tent motto, crossed off there. I actually don't like Prove Me Wrong conceptually because I think a lot of the things that he talked about, and certainly the things we talk about, are not things that bear proof. You can't prove someone is wrong about the things that we've said. But I do think that you can make your point. You can clarify things for the other person. And again, like I said at the top of this entire conversation, I want you to tell me where I'm wrong. I want you to tell me where you think I've missed a beat. You can do that with chat after the break here. You can do that with super chats. I'll try to grab all those. Super chats will be filtered for me so that I can capture them a little bit easier. I will do my best when I return to grab the chats that I think are directly responsive to the things that I have brought up in these propositions. But before I make that break, I do want to say, if you like Reasonable Minds Can Differ, if you like anything else we're doing on this channel, we are not getting a lot of revenue from YouTube ads. So please consider joining us as a member of the channel. Please consider supporting us on Patreon or doing super chats, super comments after the fact. All of that is massively appreciated. Please don't feel obligated to do any of that. This is not about the money for me. I fully expect that I'm going to lose some subscribers, some memberships just for having this conversation at all. And I have deemed that to be okay. That's acceptable to me. I want to have this conversation. I feel that I need to have this conversation with you. But please do consider supporting the channel. If you like these conversations existing, we could use all the help that you can provide. Now, as I said, is the time for you to make your point. But before that, I'm going to go and make myself a tea and come back and have these conversations, pull up these chats. And maybe if this show takes off, we could in the future have a producer grabbing chats or otherwise making available phone-in lines or maybe even appearances by people that want to have these conversations directly with me. I really think the sky's the limit for these conversations and this content and format. I hope you agree. But for right now, get your thoughts together and I will be right back very, very shortly. How about I unmute? I should definitely unmute to have this conversation, right? Welcome back. I'm sorry that took a little longer than I would have hoped, and I didn't get a tea just yet, but I have one on delivery. I hope everybody in the chat was doing well, and I'm ready to now experience your return volleys on some of this stuff. So let's show the world how reasonable minds can differ, how we don't have to hate each other as human beings, and I promise you I will be as open-minded and react as reasonably as I can to whatever you want to put in front of me. I appreciate any commentary that helps me understand what I did wrong, any commentary that would help me understand better how to make this format even better for all of you all. So please do feel free to let me know any of those things. I've started a Q&A. I've never used that format before. We'll see if that even works with the StreamYard software that I'm using. But before we get into that, let's take some of those super chats and memberships because I want to make sure that they get the proper recognition for helping support this conversation. So first, thank you so much to Sandy for gifting 10 Hoeg Law memberships. I really appreciate it, and I can barely read numbers in the font that I chose for this, so we'll see how this goes in the future. Lady Draconis, thank you for gifting 10 Hoeg Law memberships. I really appreciate all that support. And for those of you that have been with us since Hangouts and Headlines started in 2022, you just heard the squeaky door, the famous squeaky door. Here's Dad in the chat. Thank you for your passion. This can't be America. Please, no false equivalency. We are humans who have lost our humanity. Mourn with his family if you want. Ignore him, but say with no hesitation, murder can never be tolerated. Thank you, Dad. I think I did say those things as part of the propositions of this video, but I appreciate your support, both for me and this channel in general. So thank you so much, Dad. I think it is no question, as we have these conversations, that political violence and violence of all kinds is wrong. It's not the way we solve our differences, and I very much appreciate your support, Dad. Next is Nick Starro. Rick Hoeg channel should inspire you to do better. No cursing in chat. That's what my channel is for. Thank you for the support, Nick. Were people cursing in chat during this conversation? I hope not, but hey, it's understandable. These are a lot of difficult topics to discuss, a lot of difficult things to go over. I would ask, as Nick says here, that we keep the chat family friendly. The idea here is that this is a place for anybody to come in and look at these ideas and to discuss them with each other. So yeah, if you could keep the language to a PG rating, I would really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Brentwood Chic, I'm late. Going back to the beginning. Okay, Brentwood, I don't know where you are at with respect to this video right now, but thank you for the support. Thank you for being a member for so long. And I hope you are enjoying this video as you started from the beginning. Greg, thank you for the support. Says, regarding Representative Higgins and the other clowns you highlighted, both parties believe in free speech until it hurts their feelings. Then they all become the same person. Politics are justified hypocrisy, full stop. Well, this is one of the reasons why I don't make a lot of political content, and I don't dip my toes into political topics very often, because I do tend to agree that when the crown of power is held by either of the parties, at least in America, it seems like the playbook that they run is very, very similar. And I probably shouldn't have been as surprised as I legitimately am that the Trump administration and the fellow travelers on the conservative side of the political sphere in the United States looked at this situation and said, the free speech guy that was shot while talking on a college campus, we should use that as justification for curtailing free speech. Strikes me as crazy, but I probably shouldn't be as surprised as I was. Chris Black, thank you for becoming a new member. Really appreciate it. Civ Base, the takes I've heard in the aftermath of this event are even more worrisome to me than the event itself. Thank you for sharing a rational take. I certainly am trying. I can't even tell you how much this affected me when I saw it happen. And I really think it was because I saw myself not as a kindred spirit in subject matter, not in a kindred spirit of where I want the U.S. government to go, but as a kindred spirit in my love of discourse, discussion, and what politics really should be in the United States and in the countries that are operated like ours. And it really affected me. I really thought about quitting YouTube, figuring out what it was I could do with my voice and this platform. And what you see before you is the result of that long period of introspection. So I hope it helped. I hope it worked out for the people that joined us today. I'm really surprised by how many folks popped in on this video without any notion of what even the format would be before I started. So thank you so much for being here. And I think the final super chat we have, or not quite, is from Weather Report. I am for the non-government, non-violent targeting of political assassination supporters and for orgs like Antifa finally being labeled as terrorists. But Pam Bondi has to be fired for her comments. The concept of hate speech is totally un-American. Okay, so we've got a lot to unpack here, Weather Report. I really appreciate the super chat. First, the targeting of political assassination supporters. Yes, the only concern I have there is the one I articulated when I was talking about cancel culture, and that is so far as it appears to be a sliding scale that I'm very uncomfortable with as to what a assassination supporter is to someone that didn't like Charlie Kirk, right? And this is the concern with any kind of talk about hate speech or otherwise, right? Whenever you have watchers out there saying this is allowed and this isn't allowed, they are going to be making some judgment calls. And I think they've gone way too far on the cancel culture side of this with respect to this person deserves to be fired, even if they aren't in a position of trust, even if they basically only said, I thought Charlie Kirk was a blight on the earth, that is in of itself enough to get them fired. I think that's not the same thing as murder is good. It's good that Charlie Kirk was murdered. Political assassination is something we should strive for. Those kinds of comments, I think you can justify a firing for. So I think it's a sliding scale, and I'm not at all comfortable with even the non-government folks targeting these people because I think that they take too broad a brush, and I think we should speak about what it is that they should be doing. And so I have my concerns there. They are lesser concerns than when the Attorney General says things about hate speech. That is admittedly the case. So I think you make some good points. There are points that I disagree with you on, but that's the way we can talk about these issues together. These are controversial topics, and this is why I made this show, is ultimately to have these conversations with you. Don Lionart, fellow contributor to Seasoned Gaming and the Bitcast, says, suggest turning into a callback debate talk show. Honestly, I looked at the ways in which we might have a call-in or we might have a video appearance or collaboration, and realistically, they all required a producer. And so one of the things I wanted to do with this show right this second was be a proof of concept. It's a work in progress. It's why I'm calling for anybody to say what format changes would they recommend, is because I want to look at this in the future. I don't think this will be a show type that is as common as virtual legality or Hangouts and Headlines. That's not what the drive is. But when there is a topic that I think is worthy of conversation, that I think we can have this format discuss, then I want to be available to discuss it without trying to shoehorn it into a virtual legality or a Hangouts and Headlines. So I appreciate that, Don. I take that under advisement. I do think there are ways in which the process of having this conversation would be better, where you're not all silent voices. You could look at some kind of text-to-speech program or something that would make it a little bit more conversive, allow for some kind of follow-up questions. There are ways in which I think this process could be improved, but I wanted to trot it out, not let the perfect be the enemy of the good, figure out what works and what doesn't, and move forward from there. So I think that is the last of the Super Chats. Thank you so much for the support of the channel. But as I said, Super Chat's not required. I'm going to try to go through some of the more recent chats here. And if you want to highlight a point that you have against a specific proposition, please use RMCD and the number, RMCD 1, RMCD 2, all the way to 6. And I will try to grab those if I see them. Otherwise, I hope you are having a productive conversation amongst yourselves behind the scenes, and I will try to grab what I can comment on as see it in real time. Eventually, we might get a producer. We might have somebody grabbing these questions and highlighting them for me to talk about, and that might work better. But for right now, it's just me. It's me and a glass of tea now, thanks to Mrs. Hoeg. But outside of that, I'm just looking through these and grabbing what I can on the fly. So I can see there's a conversation about hate speech and naming conventions. And I think it's a good one to have amongst yourselves. But let's see here. Lewis says, the problem with chat is I have about 20 things to say, but not enough words to say any of them. Some ideas take a lot of words to explain. I agree, Lewis, and I'm sorry about that. And one of the things I wanted to add was don't feel like the super chat limits are something that you have to meet. If we could come up with a framework where you could just let me know that you have something to say and then follow it up with a series of chats, that might work. I haven't really figured out logistically how YouTube and StreamYard can let us have more fulsome conversations, at least without some kind of screening process. So that's where we're at there, but I really appreciate the comment. I tend to agree. I thought even while I was forming this, that the chat format here at the back end may not be perfect for what we want to do here, but not all of these are going to be 6 propositions. Most of these are going to be 1 or 2 at a time. That's the idea for this show. Honestly, I had to cut the list down of this episode from like 20 to the 6 that I came out with. These are the ones I really wanted to talk about. But there is so much going on here that I wanted to say. So unfortunately, I did start a Q&A, but it doesn't appear like I can grab those Q&A entries and put them on screen. So I'm going to read them out. You're going to have to trust me that I am reading them out as they are written. Sundar Keenan says on number 3, which is violence, all governmental mandate is backed up by violence. Yes, we call it state violence. What is the fundamental difference between any governmental action and violent action? All right, so this is a question about mob justice versus state justice. I love this, Sunder Keenan. This is why I have this video created. And I would say this. When we talk about the way the government acts, we use a fundamental precept of the way the United States is organized and also how British common law was organized when we started our country. And that is the notion of due process. Due process in and of itself is not a defined thing, right? There isn't a specific set of things that you do for a potential criminal and say that you have gotten the process that you are due. Instead, due process is a notion that society comes up with rules and procedures as a kind of compromise, right? All of politics is compromise. We have all these different values, all these different perspectives in the United States and any other country that we're talking about. And the act of politics is compromising on how society should function to get those things done. Due process then is, all right, I did this bad thing and I've been arrested. I've been read my rights. I've gone through a trial procedure. And now based on all of those things, the state is allowed to put me in a cage. The state is allowed to even execute me in extreme circumstances. And that is a process that is deliberate, it is slow, and it is what is agreed to by the entirety of society. Not directly in a representative democracy like the United States, but by our representatives in Congress, by the executive that signs the laws, by the courts that enforce them. And that is a fundamental difference. When I say violence is violence, and I'm talking specifically about mob violence being unacceptable, I look at things like superhero movies and the problems that they present, right? I have talked a little bit about the lack of morality in the concept of vigilante justice in various ways when I talked about like the Spider-Man movie and things that you might not have seen on this channel. But it is a consistent problem with modern media that there is this notion that if there's a corruption, if there's a problem with the institutions around us, then it is up to the singular person to go and punch their way to justice. And what I would say is that mob justice is no justice at all. That one person making that determination for everybody else is a human being just like the rest of us, prone to making mistakes, especially if they're predisposed to violence, and that the societal structures that require us to go through all these various steps, to have the very loopholes that offend so many people when people get off of the Justice Department's hit list or what have you, are important processes in running a just society. And so that's the difference. State violence is still violence. It's good of you to recognize that. Cages and guns are still cages and guns, no matter who they're wielded by. But we give the government a monopoly on that violence on the notion that we've all agreed that there's a process that they have to go through to use that violence against others. And when that process is broken, as I think you can see in certain administrations happening in the recent near past in the United States, that is a violation of the social compact in America as well. And that's the difference. Thunder Keenan number 1 says efficient identification of unreasonable minds seems to be an issue. What is the line between reasonable and unreasonable other than after it's too late and something irreparable has happened? Okay, so the very most important thing that I want to frame out here for people is just the notion that the entire phrase reasonable minds can differ is designed to highlight that you can't just label someone that differs from you as unreasonable. And unfortunately, I see people using this phrase in exactly the opposite of that intent. And so that's one thing that I wanted to frame out here. It is admittedly difficult to decide who's reasonable and unreasonable before the fact. But one thing that I did say in response to someone that tweeted at me on this particular topic is that for the most part, unreasoned positions are usually pretty easy to establish in the other person. If you're debating them, if you're otherwise in some kind of conversation with them, you can see when some predisposition, prejudgment, bigotry, or otherwise is outside the realm of reason and leading them to the conclusions that they are coming to. And if you're in front of an audience, you can highlight that for the audience. But otherwise, at that point in time, it's not useful to debate with them if you aren't otherwise showing their particular errors in judgment to an audience. And so I would recommend disengaging in that specific course. But yes, there are unreasonable people out there. That is the truth. The point of reasonable minds can differ is just to understand that just because someone differs from you, it doesn't make them de facto unreasonable. That we all have different values, that somebody can say, I've looked at the difference between privacy and security, and I've decided that security is more important than privacy, and so I'm in support of the Patriot Act. Or I've decided that privacy is more important than security, so I'm in support of this data protection law, what have you. That you can have different values that you arrived at from your life experiences or just your own personal judgment. and that those different values can have you analyzing the same set of facts and circumstances in a different way. You both used reason. You just had different values that got you to your reasonable conclusion, and that because you disagree doesn't mean that the other person is unreasonable. It just means that you have to keep talking about it, and that hopefully nobody gets shot in the process. That's what I mean by reasonable minds can differ. That's why the show exists. I understand and agree that it's difficult, but it's very important. It's incumbent upon all of us to engage in that process, because when we stop doing that, that's when everybody starts taking out their guns and we get into a real problem in America and anywhere else where that might happen. Senator Keenan then asks about number 5, cancel culture. Cultural enforcement is the traditional way of handling behavioral issues. There should be a reasonable way to do cultural enforcement online, not requiring governmental intervention. This is another aspect of cancel culture being complicated, right? Which is to say, yes, in the days before social media, there was social opprobrium. There were things that you could do in a polite society that were unacceptable, and essentially you would be shunned, either literally in certain societies or portions of society, or more colloquially as just being not seen as a good member of society. And that has a useful purpose, right? That has a useful purpose, but we have arrived at a position in 2025 that says that shunning, that behavior is unacceptable in some form or fashion in certain quarters. And I do think that there are ways in which society can engage with that question better than online outrage mobs. Right. And I've talked about that as a concept with respect to things that are much less serious, like video games, in the concept of a review bomb, where somebody says, well, these devs do X, Y, and Z politically, or they did this. And it's completely unrelated to the game, but we're going to knock down the review scores of all these things. Reasonable minds can differ as to whether that's a justified response to the developer taking political stances or what have you. I tend to be against it. I tend to want, if there's going to be any kind of cultural action, it to be directed at something specific to a product, service, or person. So I want whatever we're talking about with respect to the cancellation here to be related to the job and not just out there. Like I said, I tied it specifically to positions of trust in public, nurses and teachers, primary school teachers in particular. But I really think there is a place for society to say, I don't want to associate with you anymore. One thing that people skip in the freedom of expression, the First Amendment, is that there is a freedom of association notion tied to that freedom of expression, right? That the freedom of speech is not just the freedom to say what you want. It's also the freedom to not be compelled to say what you don't want. And it's the freedom to not associate with those that you don't think share your values or that otherwise reflect well upon your association. So I had people come into my tweets earlier this week when I was talking about some of these issues and say, essentially, where's your freedom of speech now? And I said, well, nobody's being incarcerated. These aren't government actions. But it is the freedom of the employer to say, I've looked at this. I think you're more damaging to my brand than helpful. And I don't want to be associated with you. I don't want to pay you money. I don't want to have you as an employee any longer. But much like everything else we talked about, mob justice not being any justice at all, I do think there are concerns that these things can go too far, right? That, as I said, the right seems to be on a sliding scale towards you didn't mourn Charlie properly. You didn't show enough honor to this man, and so you should be fired. I don't think that's the way we should go at all as a society. So I appreciate that, Senator Keenan. I appreciate your multiple questions. I'm sorry I can't bring them up on screen. Perhaps we will find a better way to do this in the future. I'm going to try to grab some others, and let's see what else we've got here. Greg says, with respect to number 6, leadership, who is really to blame? The leadership of America as a whole for voting these cartoon characters and putting them in a place of power? The leadership or America as a whole? Well, one thing I will say about a representative democracy is you can vote for a set of policies or preferences that seem important at the time of the election, and you don't know who you're going to, who you vote in is going to react to every crisis or controversy. So you kind of take a person as a package of positions. And so it might be that you really loved tariffs. It might be that you really loved what Donald Trump and J.D. Vance had to say about economic reform or something else. And when they come up against freedom of speech issues that you didn't think would really come up in 2025, that they falter and they fall, because we're all human beings all the way down. But I do think that they should be held accountable for these positions that are antithetical to the entirety of the American structure, government, and notions of the way that the Constitution, including the First Amendment, read. Whether or not that's the fault of the people that elected them is going to be a reasonable minds can differ kind of proposition. But I don't think it's going to be useful to just say however many people voted for Donald Trump should be exorcised from the entire American experience. Miranda Hayek says, you had a lot to say about the right's response. What is your take on the left's response? Well, again, when we talked about labels, I don't know that it's specifically useful in this instance to talk about just the political sides, because I think it really is who's in favor of death and assassination and who's in favor of discourse. But the left's response in parts has been troubling, right? In the first portion of this video, I looked at the situation that was reported about Charlie Kirk, and I saw various articles that talked about, yeah, he got shot, shooting is bad. And I think it's important to note that most of the articles, especially from mainstream outlets and most of the politicians, especially of national significance on both sides, came out and said political assassination is wrong, murder is wrong. I think you can argue about exactly how truthful they are about those positions or how performative they are, but it is important to note that it is clear that at least at the highest level, there is a social opprobrium, there is a social cost that is currently attached to just saying, yeah, shoot them all, shoot all the violence, shoot all of our opposition. That's a great thing. That is not what is shared at the top most mainstream positions of society right now. We need to keep it that way, right? That needs to be the social position. But yes, there are crazies out there realistically on both sides, but in the face of this particular situation, seemingly more so on the left, that look at it and say, it's good that Charlie Kirk got murdered. The most common version of this that I saw was in those articles that essentially went into defenses of why he might have been murdered, right? Justifications for why that would have happened, right? There was an article from a gaming outlet called Aftermath, which is ex-Kotaku writers, that had something that said, we're not really going to eulogize Charlie Kirk, are we? And said, yeah, it's bad that he got shot, but look at all the bad things he said. And that's fair to a point, to point out the whole of somebody's life. I did that as part of this video. But in the context of he just got assassinated, I'm going to write this up, it sounds like a justification for violence. And I think our outlets, our leaders on all sides could do better to try to separate themselves from, it's bad that he got shot, but, although, whatever you want to frame it as. There is no but, there is no although. Charlie Kirk was out there speaking to kids. He got shot doing that. He is a freedom of speech martyr, however you felt about the speech that he was saying. And every side should be more clear on that in its entirety. Unfortunately, the right is in power right now, so they have the government and the government's authority to say really, really bad things. The left is out there saying these things in more of the dark corners of the web. So I just personally wind up less concerned than I do with like AG Bondi and President Trump saying what they said. What else do we got here? See if I can grab some. Don says to number 5, cancel culture. I think there's a big problem with people losing their jobs over this, with rare exception, cheering for murder or bringing it into your job directly. Social media posts shouldn't cost a job. Okay, so I got to piece this apart. But Don, losing their jobs over this, obviously broader than you mean. That's why you specify it in the rest of your statement. With rare exception, cheering or bringing it into your job directly, social media posts shouldn't cost a job. Again, I think we have to be more nuanced than that. There are positions of public trust, like primary school teacher, like nurse, where I think you have to go and say, if I have to put my child in your care, if I have to be in your care, if I'm in the ICU, I can't be thinking, would you be willing to kill me if you read my Facebook posts or if you watched my Reasonable Minds Can Differ episode on YouTube? I can't be thinking that. That's not the way society can function. So at that point, we have to look into your judgment and say, maybe it's not okay from there. Social media posts shouldn't cost a job. Again, on the judgment question, you shouldn't be making social media posts that can cost you a job. But I do understand that this is a point of controversy amongst the various sides. I do think there are instances, just like I was describing with the right and taking certain posts that go too far and making people lose their jobs for that. There was a issue with the left side of the spectrum earlier this decade and before that said, we're going to go find posts that you made 10 years ago, and we're going to say this is unacceptable for anybody to have any job. And I think there is a problem where you just try to blacklist someone from having a livelihood that's no way to live. That's not the way the country can function. So I agree with you there. Here in the direct aftermath of a tragic event, I think we can maybe take a more generous view of you shouldn't be making these posts at all and applying social media posts to whether or not you should have a job, especially of public trust. But I hear your concerns here. Cancel culture is, as I say, complicated. Don, complaining about my argument in return. I only have so many characters. Entirely fair, Don. Did not mean to impugn your dignity on any of that. I am sure that you were working within the character limit that YouTube afforded you. I just know that even as you said it, you were commenting on what those exceptions might be. I hope I gave an explanation that was useful to you. Abigail says, I haven't seen anyone say it was good he got shot. I have seen essentially, I'm happy he's not here anymore. Again, there's variations of this. There's a reason lawyers don't answer hypotheticals, and it's because you can imagine variations of even what I say here as a hypothetical as being okay or not okay based on the specifics of the wording and who it was directed to. Pointing out how his own words would have supported his own death as a justifiable sacrifice for the Second Amendment does not equate to that. As a matter of fact, I think the stuff about the Second Amendment where he says essentially that a certain amount of deaths are an acceptable sacrifice for the existence of the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms in America, and the gun culture that is developed around it, is a completely justified sentiment. I think it's not what I would recommend as a Midwesterner that doesn't like to speak ill of the dead, but I totally understand it. I totally understand saying that as a political position is a kind of hoisted on your own petard kind of situation. Again, depending on how you frame it, how you characterize it, that might or might not be celebratory at the end of the day. And I think certainly folks should be wary of that. But again, you can tell I have a very complicated relationship with cancel culture, right? I'm out here making a lot of content, saying a lot of things, a lot of times. I have a Sony versus Xbox video that wind up getting me 1-star reviews from my law firm of all things. So I'm aware of just how quick the internet outrage mob can act on stupid reasons. And I would say that we are better off as a society if they do that less so. But there are places in which I look at the situation and say, yeah, that's not great, right? I think some airline pilots got fired for saying some stuff on social media. And that's, again, an area where you're putting yourself in the trust of another person. You're putting your life in their hands, and it's justifiable to worry about that. But I agree with you, Abigail, that the Second Amendment complaint, while I find it maybe untoward, depending on how it was framed immediately after his assassination, I do not think is the kind of thing that should get you fired necessarily. I also don't think there was a video game creator that was working at Sucker Punch that's making Ghost of Yote that comes out next month, who made a joke about it before we knew who the assassin was, that said, I hope his name is Mario so he can tell Luigi he's got his back or something like that. And it was a joke. And I think it was very ill-informed. I think it was not reading the room. It was an ill-advised tweet. Does that mean you should get fired? I don't think so necessarily. But I can look at Sony and Sucker Punch and say, you know what? This is too much heat. We're trying to sell a game in 2 weeks. And so we don't want to be associated with you, and you should know better. So again, complicated relationship. I don't have a great answer for cancel culture as a notion. I think it really is a case by case kind of analysis, and nobody's willing to do that. So I'm not willing to throw cancel culture out in the trash. I'm also not willing to adopt it as the way forward for American society. Okay, Mark, I appreciate the super chat, but I'm not going to read out conspiracy theories on the notion of the assassin. So I appreciate the support for the channel, but I'm not reading out that super chat. Big Afro Man 14, thank you for the support. Says, something that's sickening to me is how the right is clearly using Charlie to further whatever agenda they have, and it's coming off as performative. I agree. Honestly, I think that using this particular case, this assassination, as the basis for attacking free speech is crazy. It's crazy to me. If I had been president, and don't make me president, I'm not going to seek it out, but don't try. If I had been president, I would have tried to characterize this as essentially an assassination of free speech, might have made it a federal holiday, and said, we will remember this as when we stood up in favor of free speech and understood that our society can be better, will be better, if we allow ourselves to disagree on these important issues of the day, not strike out, lash out, however you want to frame it, at those that I view as my political enemies, whether you're AG Bondi, whether you're President Trump. And I do think that that is concerning. I do. Merlin Mass, thank you for the support. Says, hey, I know you've been back for a while, but I hadn't really caught up. Glad to see you back on. Definitely one of my favorite law YouTubers. Thank you, Merlin Mast. I really appreciate it. I was intending to take September off for the most part. It's been a very difficult time at Hoeg House. I think some of you may have seen that I made a community post earlier this month that said, basically, I don't know when I'll be back. We're going through certain transitions here. We are in a season of change, as I've said, I think once or twice on Twitter. And so I was not anticipating making a video at all this month. I don't know when my next video after this will be, but I thought this was so important. I felt so called to make this kind of commentary on this particular issue that I could not sit idly on my hands. And so I'm very glad that all of you found me here on a kind of random Wednesday to talk over these things. I hope it was helpful. I really appreciate all the support. Thank you, Merlin Mast. Lucius Augustus says, don't like the idea of the whitewashing of his legacy, giving him a Medal of Honor, flag at half-mast, not able to point out his own beliefs, or you're fired. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair criticism. I do not think he was a saint. I don't really think anybody that we kind of give honorifics to in the federal government's light is a saint. I don't think Abraham Lincoln was a saint. I don't think Martin Luther King was a saint. It's just the nature of being a human, right? There's very few saints out there, folks. I'm not one of them, guarantee it. But I do think that there is an argument to be made that we've gone a little above and beyond in this particular score, but we haven't had a political assassination in America in many decades. And I think this was an important one, right? This was not just an assassination in a random time or place. This was an assassination at a public speaking event that was ostensibly, however you feel about the way the message was delivered, about freedom of speech. This was a bullet to freedom of speech, not just to Charlie Kirk. And I think that's the way a lot of people see it. Henhouse Bathco, thank you for the support. Hoeg, just a message to tell you how much I appreciate that you're keeping free speech alive. We've lost the ability, I think, to have reasoned conversations as a society. Reasonable minds can differ. Thank you, Henhouse Bathco. I believe that in the very heart of my soul. Reasonable minds can differ. I know a lot of people on both sides of the political equation that differ with me on a great many things. And I can still see how they arrived at the places that they arrived. We have conversations about them. And I tell you what, when we finish those conversations, we're both better off. That's what I believe truly and deeply. And I hope I've been able to convey that all to you. All right. I think that's going to be about it for us. I really didn't know, honestly, how many comments you all were going to make. I think I've addressed all of the questions that made it into the Q&A. I'll see if I can work out a better system for that. And I will remind people of the RMCD number concept earlier. They do kind of pop out to me so I can flag them a little bit easier. RMCD number 4 on labels. I do agree with labels can be dehumanizing, or labels are often dehumanizing, or even labels are mostly dehumanizing. Thank you. I love that there's a lawyering in that very honest answer. Yes, labels, unfortunately, are both dehumanizing and pretty much necessary to survive in modern life, right? You can't know every possible thing about every possible person. And so it is useful to know that Charlie Kirk was a conservative commentator versus a liberal or left commentator, however you want to phrase that. That is useful for you to know where he was coming from, what he was trying to achieve. It is useful to know that he was trying to help Donald Trump get elected. It is not useful to take those notions and say, I know exactly what that person was about. I know what was in his heart. We don't know that. We don't know that about anybody. We don't know that about our spouse. We don't know that about our kids. We have to do our best to continue communicating with the limited facilities that we have, our mouths and our ears, to understand each other better. And that's really what I wanted to communicate with that labels are way too often used to short circuit the entirety of reasonable minds differing. Oh, he's a Nazi? I don't have to listen to anything he has to say. even if he maybe makes some good points that could help me be informed about how society should function or how I should think about reality. He's a Nazi. I don't have to listen to him. And it's very easy for people to do that. And when you combine that with go out there and punch a Nazi, it becomes very easy to justify violence. And that's where I really have a problem with that particular kind of linguistic sleight of hand. Oh, I was reading them in reverse. I thought that was for labels. All right. Joshua, I apologize for this. I get them in reverse. So this is 3 of 4. I do probably wholly agree with the generic point of this proposition, but I have at this time issues with it technically. If it is understood as all labels are dehumanizing, well, hopefully I clarified that a little bit. I will try to do this better. 1 of 4. I might need definitional clarity on this one. Joshua, you are a lawyer, aren't you? I view the term labels very much akin to terms for categories. If I am wrong in this conclusion or application, then please illuminate me. I hope I've answered most of that. And I apologize for butchering this completely. As I said at the top, this is a work in progress, right? We are going to figure this format out. If you were here for the first Hangouts and Headlines, it was just called Headlines. It was an absolute train wreck of me not knowing where the buttons were at all. I was on for 14 hours. I definitely can't do that all with you anymore. But I'm doing my best, and I really appreciate you for sticking it out with me. With the perspective, the term humans is a label, and if there's a reasonable perspective that humans is a dehumanizing label, I would genuinely love to hear it. Joshua, I like the cut of your jib, my friend. Yes, that is fair, that humans is a label, that humans as a label is tautologically not dehumanizing, but while I can appreciate that argument, I don't think it's terribly useful to what I was talking about with specificity. So, yes, I think you make some good points. Labels do have their usefulness. That's why we use them. In all honesty, you're not using left and right, most of us, to just deliberately dehumanize or demonize the opposition. You're using it to better understand the world around you. It's better to understand that New York Times comes from a more left position, that the New York Post comes from a more right position, because as I say in Hangouts and Headlines, it's important to know people's tilts to understand how they're choosing to tell you the news they're choosing to tell you and how they're describing it to you. So that's useful in all walks of life. But I did want to highlight that it can be used to the detriment of all, especially when we start to get into derogatory terms or terms that are derogatory on their face. All right, I think I've grabbed everything now. So, 30-second warning here. I'm going to be at the bottom of this chat right now, but I really appreciate you all being here, more than 300 strong, on the inaugural episode of Reasonable Minds Can Differ. My hope is that we can have these conversations going into the future, that you will be able to think about the fact that you were here during the first episode when we're just huge, when the entire internet has changed away from outrage mobs and cancel culture, and just everybody agrees that reasonable minds can differ, and everybody's having polite, reasoned conversation over internet tea and just respecting each other's humanity and dignity, and that you can say, yep, I was there when it started. We got something done that day, and I really appreciate you all. Thank you so much. I will see you next time. Don't know when that will be, but I'm glad we had this conversation. I'm glad that I did it, and I hope that it was good for all of you as well.